Our next speaker is Daniel Schleifer with the USGS and Northern Arizona University. He's going to talk about impacts of these climate changes on drought in the sagebrush region.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I'm Daniel Schleifer. I'm part of John's larger group. You can see here in this slide all together, little thumbnails. And I'm trying to build on Emma's great talk and try to think about and translate that what some of these changes mean for drought in the systems we care about. But before I dig into some of the details, I just want to take a sort of a global perspective and talk very briefly about drylands. And this map shows the global extent of dryland areas. They cover about 40% of the terrestrial surface, so are really important systems to understand globally as well as regionally. They offer many ecosystem services, including a large portion of our food production. Then for the Western US, much of the area are drylands, as is indicated by that aridity index, and that's sort of a climatological perspective on these long-term conditions that identifies these drylands. And that middle map here shows that much of the public and tribal lands and all of the sagebrush regions are drylands. And these are systems where the access to moisture, when and where and how much, really shapes plant communities and these ecosystem services that we rely on. So I'd like to cover 4 points today, talk a little bit about how we can think about ecological drought, and that is sort of thinking about the balance between the water demand and supply in these systems. Then we will look at some historical trends in ecological drought, building on what we just heard from Emma's talk. Then look at some future projections of drought, and then try to translate that into what this means specifically for sagebrush ecosystems. Usually when we think about drought, we just think about the absence of precipitation, or it's a dry spell. There was no rain. Ecological drought is a little bit more complex, as it is sort of the balance between water demand and supply. And often we think about this in something like a conceptual way, as this diagram illustrates, where we have a continuum from the soil through the plants, the roots and the plants and the canopy into the atmosphere. And so in the atmosphere, on the water demand side, you can think about the dryness of the atmosphere, how much the atmosphere tries to demand moisture from a system. And temperature is a primary driver, as Emma explained. Warmer air holds more moisture. And so rising temperature means that the atmosphere demands more moisture from the system. Some of the ways we can quantify that are water pressure deficit or potential evapotranspiration. And then that demand is met by evapotranspiration of the system. That is the evaporation component from bare soil surfaces or open water, and transpiration that is going through the vegetation. So this is the demand side of that balance. The water supply side starts with the soil moisture that is available for plants for utilization. And precipitation is the primary input of that, but the actual supply is much more complex. So in the soil, you need to think about where in the soil profile is moisture available for plants. When in a season can plants utilize that moisture, and how much of it is there? So there's a number of metrics that try to approximate those conditions, such as the Palmer Drought Severity Index and SPEI. But ideally, when we try to think about ecological drought, we would want to dig into some of the details of soil moisture, the supply, and the water demand, and build a balanced perspective on there. Understanding that complexity of that balance between water demand and supply is really helpful to help us understand how drought and water limitation shapes these dryland vegetation and dryland ecosystems. And it helps us to understand ongoing climate change. And so digging a little more into that complexity of ecological drought, we want to think about plants have different rooting depths and that they utilize moisture from different depths, maybe at different times of the year. On average, herbaceous species such as forbs and grasses have shallow or medium deep roots, and woody species on average have deeper roots. Now, for instance, big sagebrush has a two-tiered root system. It has shallow roots that it can access moisture from shallow surfaces, such as small precipitation event during the summer. But it also has deep root systems that it can tap into moisture that is stored at greater depth. And so the availability of moisture across that soil profile varies and is important. And with deep soil moisture is promoted by different factors, such as coarse soil textures, such as sandy soils or soils with lots of coarse fragments. Cool season precipitation also promotes deep moisture, as during the cool season, evaporation is lower and precipitation can percolate deeper into the soil. Large precipitation events, or also melt of snowpack, that snow accumulated during the cold season, they can recharge deeper into the soil and get that moisture deep into the soil, where it can be stored into the warm season. And then that is all mediated by how efficient vegetation is using water, which is also a function of the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that Emma talked also about a bit. So now that we talked a little bit about ecological drought and some of the ways to think about that balance between the water demand and the supply in the system, now let's look at some of the observed historical trends. So these are the same figures from that 5th National Climate Assessment Report that we saw in Emma's talk. And so we saw that temperatures have been increasing, and increasing temperatures means that the atmosphere has a higher demand on a system. And then on the precipitation side, we saw that we have maybe a little less or about the same amount of annual months, but less summer precipitation, maybe except for some summer monsoon areas. And so we have a relative shift of that precipitation coming towards the cool season. And as we just saw, that more cool season precipitation may have the ability to relatively shift more moisture away from the surface, where maybe the surface gets dry during the warm season into greater depth. So when we then translate these meteorological variables into ecological drought, into soil moisture, as Fang Wei Seng and Joel Biderman have done, we worked with them on some of these soil moisture trends over the last 40 years. This map shows a number of stations where we looked at the soil moisture trends at 2 different soil depths. And the red dots indicate decreases in soil moisture, and the blue dots are increases. And so we see that there's widespread decreases in soil moisture, except for increases in the Great Plains areas in the northeastern portion here, which matches roughly the overall trends that we have observed in temperature and precipitation. When we compare these 2 different soil depths, you see that there's more color, stronger trends in the shallow soils, and that shift matches roughly that shift in precipitation, the relative shift in precipitation towards the cool season, and that may imply that shift of moisture towards greater depths, soil depths, may favor deeper rooted species over more shallow rooted species. So these are some of the historical trends in drought, and now let's look into some of the future projections. That's also maps from that 5th National Climate Assessment Report of projections of soil moisture over the next several decades during the summer months. And so for our areas, this map suggests modest overall decreases. In some areas, very small increases. The 2 smaller maps on the right-hand side, they show some of the variation among models and possible trajectories, and also studies. And so there's some amount of variation. But I think it's always important to distinguish between overall uncertainty in something that we just don't know about or is very variable, from uncertainty in the margins, and that differs from the main signal. And so one way to differentiate those is to identify robust signals across models or projections, or the amount of agreement that we have. And so that's something that we tried to do in this paper here that John led a few years ago. This map shows two different approaches to think about ecological drought. So we have the total number of dry days in the shallow soils on the left side, and the duration of the longest dry periods in deeper soils on the right side. And the cross-hatched areas are areas where that signal is robust across many climate model projections. So the green colors, mostly in the northern part, indicates a robust signal for some of less drought, less dry days in these areas. And the brown colors indicate robust increases in the number of these dry days. And maybe you look, squint your eyes, you can see that maybe in the Great Basin there's a mix and not many robust signals. And I think that has been reflected on the previous map. So now that we looked at some of these future projections of ecological drought, let's try to think about how we can interpret those results for the sagebrush ecosystem. And again, I start with just the meteorological perspective of temperature. We saw that temperature is rising, and that means greater demand from the atmosphere for moisture. And in that paper that I just brought up, we also looked at the temperature when the soils are dry during the hot summer months. And those temperatures are rising faster than average temperatures. That means that this puts a greater stress on these sagebrush systems. And that may lead to mortality events, such as that photo illustrates from a few years ago in southwestern Wyoming. Another perspective to think about what this means for the sagebrush region is to think about the restoration challenge that we face across these landscapes. And one way to do that is to use Jean Chambers' R&R indicators approach, the resilience and resistance indicators. And so we worked with her and her team to come up with an approach that allows us to look at that under future projections. So we started out with a set of metrics that all describe different aspects of ecological drought and are responsive to climate change. Then we developed predictive models of those R&R indicators with a publication from last year led by Jean. And so to just briefly recap, that this is the resistance to cheatgrass invasion of a system and the indicator of resilience of a system to recover from stress or disturbances, such as a drought or fiery event. And that map here on the left shows those, when we map that model across the landscape. You can see here in red, the low category, and then the medium low and the other categories in the orange and blue colors. And I think probably many of you are familiar with a map like that. And then the next step was to use climate model projections to look into the future. And that's this middle map here, where we saw, maybe if you squint your eyes, more red, more oranges. And that we quantified those changes on the right-hand side. And you just look at that. And so we see that most of the area that has historically been in the low category remained low, and those are the dark gray areas, such as in the Great Basin and areas. Other categories either showed a decrease, to be mapped here in the purples, or remained the same. But we found basically no increases in these R&R indicators. And it was the moderate R&R categories that had the most widespread decreases, as we can see here across much of Wyoming and some of the northern basin and range areas and elsewhere. And so the interpretation is that climate change amplifies the restoration challenges as through the perspective of these R&R indicators. So let's try to summarize all of that a bit together. And so we have these sagebrush ecosystems that are drylands. They are shaped by water limitations and drought. So they have this very specific seasonal soil moisture pattern. We looked at some observed increases over the last few decades in aspects contribute to ecological and drought, both in the moisture demand side, we looked at temperature, and in the shifts or decreases in the supply side, we looked at precipitation and soil moisture. And then the climate projections, such as that continued changes in those variables, and some of those we looked at that they are robust signals across models, because they're more tightly linked to temperature, where we have very clear signals. And that means that for the sagebrush region, that some of these areas expect to remain, at least on average, climatically suitable. So maybe we saw that some of this area, maybe particularly the northern part, have maybe more precipitation, but also with higher temperatures, we have both sides of that balance of water and demand and supply that are increasing. And so even if we have more precipitation, but we also have higher temperatures, and so maybe on average, we stay roughly the same. But because we are also increasing all of that, and the higher temperatures during dry periods are increasing even faster. We may have more extreme events, more heat events, and that's putting added stresses on these systems. In looking at one perspective of the restoration challenge, we saw that we probably need to expect that this becomes harder, probably likely because there's more stress on these systems. And so even if they remain suitable, they may be harder to restore after a stress event. And one interpretation is that land uses that add further stress on this vegetation may need to be carefully considered. And so if you have questions, please, I think we should have some time to discuss those. And if not, you can reach out to me after.